Dawn creeps over a world built by men, ruled by men, and broken by men, and somewhere in that slow-bleeding sunrise, a single figure steps out of the shadows. His boots crush the frostbitten ground, his breath ghosts in the cold air, and his past follows behind him like a silent, feral animal that refuses to die. He's not a hero. He's not a villain. He's something far more dangerous. Because every legend begins with a man who survived what should have killed him, and kept walking. Tonight, you'll step into his world, a world shaped by power, vengeance, and the thin line between justice and destruction. You'll feel the grit under his nails, the fire in his chest, the weight of every decision carving him into something unrecognizable. And before the story is done, you might even question what you would have done in his place. After all, when a man is pushed far enough, what remains isn't just rage. It's purpose, and purpose can burn through anything. Before we dive deeper, pause for a moment, breathe in, settle in. If you're drawn to stories carved from real struggle, real grit, and real fire, you're in the right place. Tap the like button so more people find this journey, and subscribe if you want more cinematic deep dives into the lives of men who changed everything by refusing to break. Drop a comment too. I read them all, and your thoughts shape what we explore next. Firelight flickered across his jaw as he marched through the wreckage, every ember reflecting the truth he refused to speak aloud. No man survives a night like this without losing something he can never reclaim again. Smoke clung to his clothes, threading through the scars beneath them, each mark a memory carved by another man's violence. Yet his stride never faltered, as if pain itself had learned to fear disappointing him. Beneath his boots, the ground trembled with echoes of the fight he'd barely escaped, splintered planks and shattered iron hinting at the male fury that had erupted here only moments before everything collapsed into flame. The forest swallowed him as he stepped into its shadows, branches brushing his shoulders like cautious brothers recognizing one of their own, a man forged through endless trials and kept upright by nothing but stubborn fire. A cold wind lashed across his face, carrying ash and the metallic scent of blood, but he welcomed it, because cold meant he was still alive, still moving, still refusing the death so many men had predicted. He glanced back once, not in regret but acknowledgement, the quiet respect one male gives another when surviving requires leaving everything behind, even the ghosts waiting patiently for him to break. His breath leaked into the air like steam escaping an old engine, labored but determined, each inhale feeding the relentless purpose that had fused itself to his bones the night another man tried and failed to end him. Branches cracked underfoot as he climbed the ridge, his hands brushing rock and bark, his muscles shaking with exhaustion. But inside him swelled a force that no weapon, no man, no fire had been able to smother. Distant thunder rolled across the hills, reminding him that storms don't ask permission to arrive, and neither did he anymore, because he'd crossed the threshold between hunted and hunter without bothering to look for a way back. At the ridge top, he paused just long enough to survey the valley below, a stretch of land owned by men drunk on their own power, men who'd soon learn what it meant to push the wrong brother too far. Moonlight slid across his face, tracing the hardened lines etched by years of betrayal, and in that pale glow he seemed older, forged, less a wanderer, and more the inevitable consequence of another man's cruelty. He didn't fear the dark waiting below, because darkness had been his companion for years, a patient male sibling walking beside him every night he refused to stay broken. Every morning he rose again uninvited. Wine rustled through the pines, whispering warnings he ignored, because warnings were for men still deciding who they were, and he'd made his choice a long time ago when a knife pressed against his throat failed to finish him. With one slow exhale, he descended the ridge, his boots sinking into damp soil as he followed a path only instinct revealed, the unspoken language every man learns when hunted long enough to become the danger himself. Lights flickered from a shack in the distance, faint and careless, and he felt the familiar thrum under his ribs, the one that told him trouble waited for him there, trouble wearing a face he once trusted. He approached the shack with footsteps heavy but sure, the steady rhythm of a man who no longer questioned consequences, because consequences lost their meaning the day the world decided he wasn't meant to survive. Inside, muffled voices argued sharp, male, impatient, and his jaw tightened as their tones dragged him backward into memory, to alliances shattered in the dirt and promises buried before sunrise. He pressed a hand against the door, feeling the wood tremble, as though the building itself recognized him and feared what he might do next, a man stripped of hesitation and too worn to pretend virtue. When he pushed the door open, Silence crashed through the room, every man inside freezing mid-breath as they saw him standing there, smoke still clinging to his hair like a warning sculpted in shadow. Their faces wide-eyed, tense, guilty told him everything he needed to know, because men don't hide their fear well when the ghost they created walks back into the room still breathing and unwilling to forgive. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm, making sure each man heard the click of wood against wood, a sound heavy with meaning and impossible to misunderstand. No one spoke first. In a room full of men who claimed strength, none dared test the storm they had once underestimated, the storm now staring back at them with eyes forged in fire and survival. His gaze scanned their faces, pausing on each one as though measuring debt, and every man flinched under the weight of acknowledgement, because a silent reckoning always hits harder than shouted rage. He walked to the center of the room with the slow, lethal grace of a predator rediscovering his terrain, and the men instinctively shifted aside, fear teaching them choreography they'd never practiced. The one closest to him swallowed hard, bravado fading like mist, and for a moment he looked like a boy pretending at manhood, unaware the game had ended the moment the door creaked open. A chair scraped across the floor as someone backed away too quickly, the sound sharp and clumsy, betraying nerves none of them could hide, because courage wilted fast when confronted by a survivor they'd buried in memory. He stopped near the table, fingers brushing its rough edge, each touch calculated, reminding these men that everything in this room, every decision, every lie had led exactly to this one unavoidable moment. One man finally attempted speech, voice cracking like an old hinge, but the survivor's stare pinned him silent, an unspoken declaration that explanations were as worthless as the loyalty they'd shattered. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with sweat and fear, and the space felt too small for the tension coiling between them, a tension born from unfinished business and the inevitability that followed him like shadow. He rolled his shoulders, feeling bruises pulse under his shirt, reminders of the ambush he'd crawled out of, reminders that every man in this room had played a part in the night meant to end him. The survivor's voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, a controlled burn beneath the words, carrying the weight of betrayal as effortlessly as he carried the scars across his back. Not one man interrupted him. Not one dared breathe too loudly, because they'd each sensed the truth simmering beneath the surface. The man they tried to destroy wasn't seeking forgiveness, he sought reckoning. Rain began tapping the roof above them, steady and cold, as if the storm outside recognized the one brewing within, a convergence of consequence and fury shaped entirely by male hands. His final words hung in the air like a blade suspended over their heads, a promise carved from survival and sharpened by fire. He wasn't done, he wouldn't leave, and every man in that shack understood it. And as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, each man realized what lay ahead was not mercy, not negotiation, but the unavoidable truth of what happens when a betrayed survivor returns for what is owed. Steel groaned beneath his palms as he tightened the straps of his pack, every movement deliberate, every breath steady, because a man preparing for the hunt understands silence better than speeches and purpose better than comfort. Wine swept across the barren ridge, tugging at his coat like a persistent brother urging caution, but he ignored the warning because once a man commits to a path carved by betrayal, softness becomes a luxury he cannot afford. He studied the distant valley, a maze of rusted towers and abandoned workshops where dangerous men gathered, each one carrying a path sharp enough to cut, and he smiled faintly because danger meant clarity, and clarity kept him alive. The trail ahead slithered downward between broken stones, each step echoing memories of nights he'd fought barefoot through mud and steel, learning the way men become weapons when pushed far enough into the dark. A crow landed nearby, tilting its head as though judging his resolve, but he simply nodded back, acknowledging one survivor to another, to creatures shaped by hunger, instinct, and the cold mathematics of endurance. Far below, smoke drifted from an old factory chimney, its gray plume rising like a signal from men who believed they controlled the valley, unaware that a storm wearing boots and scars was already descending toward them. He paused only once, hand resting on the hilt of the knife strapped to his thigh, remembering the man who'd given it to him years ago, a mentor lost to treachery and now immortalized through sharpened steel and grit. The descent grew steeper, rocks shifting underfoot, each slide reminding him of ambushes survived and bones broken, yet he moved with calm certainty, a rhythm learned in places where hesitation meant another man walked away with your breath. When he reached the valley floor, the soil felt different, damp, heavy, suspicious as though it had absorbed the histories of the men who'd bled across it, storing their regrets like secrets waiting to be whispered. He walked toward the factory ruins, boots crunching through shattered glass and warped metal, every sound announcing his arrival, because stealth didn't matter when a man wanted his enemies to feel him coming. Through a cracked window, he spotted movement, a silhouette pacing, broad-shouldered, impatient, the unmistakable posture of a fighter accustomed to violence, and he felt something tighten in his chest, not fear but recognition. His shadow stretched long across the courtyard as he stepped inside, dust swirling around his boots, each mote illuminated by the faint light cutting through the broken roof like thin, unforgiving blades. The first man spotted him instantly, reaching for a pipe, muscles coiling in instinctive aggression, but the survivor merely exhaled, his expression calm, because this confrontation was less about danger and more about message. They circled each other slowly, boots scraping concrete, breath sharp, creating a rhythm older than language, a wordless dialogue men had shared since the first fist was thrown in desperation or pride. When the man lunged, he dodged with trained ease, catching the wrist and twisting, the crack echoing through the factory like a verdict read aloud, the kind that ends arguments permanently. He lowered the man gently to the ground, not out of mercy but ritual, because a true fighter respects the fallen even when they stand on opposite ends of justice's blade. Voices echoed deeper inside the ruin, low, rough, suspicious, and his pulse quickened not from fear but anticipation, the same electric hum a man feels before his past and future collide in one violent breath. He strode forward between rusted conveyors, his silhouette framed by skeletal machinery, and each step felt like walking through time, retracing paths stained by choices that shaped him into the weapon he'd become. The second attacker charged from the shadows, swinging a chain, but the survivor ducked beneath the arc, striking ribs twice with brutal precision, hearing the air leave the man's lungs like a confession forced from unwilling lips. He dragged the unconscious body aside, laying it near a collapsed beam, and wiped sweat from his brow, his breath steadying as the factory hummed around him like an old beast waking. Light flickered overhead, casting his reflection in shards of broken mirrors scattered across the wall, each fragment showing a different version of the man he used to be, none strong enough to survive this night. He moved through the next corridor with slow confidence, hand brushing the wall for balance, fingers tracing grooves carved by older workers who'd fought in these halls long before the factory became a haven for fugitives. The air smelled of oil and rust, thick with the ghosts of men who had labored here, and he inhaled deeply, letting their unspoken legacy settle into his ribs like armor forged from memory. Ahead, 3 men waited by a stack of crates, their postures rigid and guarded, yet beneath their hostility lingered uncertainty because they'd all heard stories of the survivor who crawled from fire refusing to die. He stepped into the open, shoulders squared, gaze steady, making no attempt to hide the bruises painting his skin or the relentless purpose burning in his eyes, a sight that forced all 3 men to hesitate. The first swung a crowbar, missing by inches. The survivor countered with a knee to the stomach, a palm strike to the jaw, and one decisive blow that sent the man sprawling in the dust. The remaining 2 attacked together, but he met them head-on, trading hits with the kind of controlled fury only a man shaped by betrayal can wield, leaving both groaning on the cracked concrete. Breathing hard, he surveyed the aftermath, wiping blood from his knuckles, and felt an old truth thrum beneath his heartbeat. Violence was never his first language, but it had become the one he spoke most fluently. A heavy door creaked somewhere deeper inside, followed by a low male voice muttering orders, the kind of voice he hadn't heard in years, the kind that belonged to a man responsible for shaping his pain. He followed the sound, boots quiet now, purpose sharpening with every step, because the man waiting ahead wasn't just an enemy, he was the architect of the fire that tried and failed to consume him. At the final doorway, he paused, not from doubt but preparation, rolling his shoulders and steadying his breath, readying every muscle for the reckoning forged long before tonight. And when he stepped through, the room fell silent, because the man inside, broad, scarred, unrepentant, recognized him instantly, and the survivor saw fear flicker for the first time in eyes that once watched him burn. The factory trembled in the hush between them, 2 men bound by a past carved in ash, standing seconds away from the collision that would decide which of them walked out of the valley alive. The metal door slammed behind him, sealing him inside the dim chamber where cold air clung to the walls like a warning, and every instinct in his body told him the man ahead had been expecting this confrontation. Shadows stretched across the floor as he moved forward, boots echoing with a slow confidence earned through scars, each step a reminder that he'd clawed his way through fire to reach this moment without flinching. His opponent stood at the far end of the room, broad and unmoving, a man built from iron discipline and violent purpose, someone who'd once fought beside him before betrayal carved a permanent line between them. A low hum from the broken generator pulsed through the space, flickering lights casting fractured shapes across both men's faces, highlighting years of damage, endurance, and choices that couldn't be taken back. He felt the weight of the moment settle over his shoulders, not fear but gravity, the kind that descends when men understand only one future can exist after the next few minutes unfold. The man across from him cracked his knuckles slowly, a deliberate gesture signaling readiness, confidence, and ownership of the violence that was about to erupt between them, a performance sharpened from countless brutal victories. He didn't bother responding with bravado, because men who survive long enough learn silence carries more force than any threat, and his silence spoke of nights spent refusing death itself. A stale draft brushed his jawline, carrying the metallic scent of old battles fought in this very room, and he wondered how many men had entered confident and left without breath in their lungs. His opponent stepped forward, each stride heavy and resolute, boots grinding against the concrete like distant thunder, that sound reminding him of training sessions where the man now facing him had nearly broken him. He adjusted his stance, planting his feet shoulder-width apart, grounding himself in techniques taught through bruises and repetition, knowing that every move he made tonight carried the weight of everything that came before. The room shrank around them, not physically but in spirit, leaving only two men locked in a fate they'd both shaped with their own hands, their shared past tightening like rope around their throats. His opponent's voice cut through the tense quiet, deep and unyielding, delivering words filled with authority and resentment, each syllable a hammer reshaping the air into something colder and far more dangerous. He stared back, jaw set, refusing to blink, because blinking meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was a weakness men like them never permitted themselves to show in moments that demanded absolute resolve. A moment of stillness stretched razor-thin between them, almost sacred in its intensity, a final breath before the storm, the kind of pause only found when men truly understand the stakes. He moved first, launching forward not with desperation but controlled ferocity, the kind honed through years of crawling out of ruin with blooded knuckles and teeth clenched against impossible odds. Their bodies collided like two collapsing towers, the impact shaking dust from the ceiling, bone smashing against bone, each strike carrying unspoken memory and every unhealed wound of their shared history. Fists cracked against ribs, forearms intercepted blows meant to shatter, and sweat poured from their skin as they fought with a brutality born from betrayal, exhaustion, and a commitment to finish what started years ago. His opponent swung wide, powerful but predictable, and he ducked beneath the arc, delivering a sharp strike to the man's throat, forcing a staggered cough that hinted at the first fracture in his composure. Pain shot through his own body as he dodged the counterattack, a reminder that even a survivor's resilience had limits, but limits meant nothing tonight, because this battle demanded everything he had left. Both men stepped back for a breath, chests heaving, eyes locked like wolves circling for the perfect opening, neither willing to concede ground or admit the toll the fight had already taken. He tasted iron as blood traced the corner of his lip, a familiar bitterness fueling the simmering fire in his chest, the fire that burned brighter whenever he faced a man who once mattered. His opponent lunged again, faster this time, fury sharpening his movements, but he sidestepped and slammed his elbow into the back of the man's skull, sending him crashing against a rusted metal table. The table screeched under the impact, its legs buckling, and for a heartbeat the opponent stayed down, dazed, giving him a glimpse of a world where this battle finally shifted in his favor. He approached cautiously, muscles tense, because men like his opponent never surrendered. They only paused long enough to gather strength for another devastating strike aimed at reclaiming dominance. Sure enough, the downed man surged upward with renewed aggression, catching him off guard with a brutal headbutt that sent stars exploding across his vision and nearly knocked him off his feet. He steadied himself with a growl deep in his throat, shaking off the pain, because he'd endured worse nights and survived worse men, and nothing would stop him now from finishing this. With a burst of strength, he grabbed his opponent's coat and hurled him across the room, watching him slam into the steel wall with enough force to rattle the entire chamber. His opponent tried to rise, knees trembling, breath ragged, but the survivor could see the cracks spreading through the man's resolve, each moment revealing more weakness than the one before. He closed the distance again, every footstep echoing with the weight of a final decision, one that would end the long cycle of violence between them and allow him to walk forward unburdened. The last strike he delivered was clean, decisive, and absolute, dropping his opponent to the floor with eyes wide in stunned disbelief, the kind only found when a man realizes he has been defeated by his own creation. He stood over the fallen man, chest rising with slow victory, not fueled by arrogance but by the calm of closure, the quiet internal shift that comes when a fight shaping years finally reaches its end. He wiped sweat from his brow, feeling the tremor of adrenaline fading, and allowed himself a single breath of hard-earned relief, knowing this battle carved a new direction for him to follow. Then he turned toward the exit, the dim hallway ahead opening like a new horizon, ready for whatever came next, because a man who survives battles like this never returns to who he was before. He stepped into the night, the cold biting at his skin as though testing the resolve running through his veins, and every shadow around him shifted like old rivals waiting for the moment he finally slipped. The factory behind him groaned as metal settled, echoing with the memory of fists, blood, and the man he'd left on the floor, yet he didn't look back because the past never held anything he needed anymore. Wine rushed across the open lot, carrying dust and the faint scent of rust, brushing over him like a warning delivered by another hardened wanderer who'd learned to respect the weight of unfinished business. He tightened the straps of his pack, feeling every bruise flare under pressure, a reminder that survival demanded a toll, and tonight he'd pay just enough to keep moving toward the next piece of truth. The city stretched before him, a maze of steel and flickering lights where dangerous men operated under the illusion that alarms, fences, and threats could protect them from consequences finally catching up. He crossed the rail yard with long, steady strides, boots clanking over the tracks, each metallic note marking a continuation of the path he'd carved by force, loss, and a refusal to remain who he once was. A cargo train rumbled in the distance, its massive silhouette cutting through the dark like a beast on rails, and he paused to let the thunderous machine pass, studying its markings for clues he desperately needed. He spotted the insignia he'd expected, an emblem belonging to a transport network run by men who believed themselves untouchable, and felt a cold satisfaction settle into his chest like a final puzzle piece. Silence fell again when the last rail car disappeared into the night, leaving him alone with the echo of steel and the undeniable knowledge that his next target waited somewhere within that system's hidden roots. He turned toward an abandoned signal tower, climbing its rusted ladder with practiced efficiency, his muscles straining but his grip never wavering, because men with purpose don't fall, they rise despite everything. At the top, he scanned the horizon, catching the faint glimmer of lights outlining a remote freight hub, a place where illicit shipments moved quietly under the supervision of men who'd crossed his path before. His jaw clenched, remembering the night those same men betrayed his closest ally, leaving the man bleeding beneath broken crates, while they vanished with the evidence that proved everything he now hunted. He exhaled slowly, letting the old rage burn steady but controlled, because he'd learned long ago that a man fueled by precision outlasts a man fueled by blind fury every single time. The ladder rattled behind him as he descended, boots hitting the ground with enough impact to jolt his sore ribs, yet he pushed forward, letting the pain sharpen his senses instead of slowing him down. He approached the edge of the freight hub, crouching behind stacked containers coated in grime, the air humming with generators and distant engines, the signature soundscape of men working in secret. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, both heavily built, both confident in the security surrounding them, and he watched their movements with the patience of a hunter studying prey from higher ground. Their routine repeated every 30 seconds, revealing a subtle blind spot near a damaged floodlight, and he smiled faintly because men who underestimate darkness often gift opportunity to those shaped by it. When they turned their backs, he sprinted forward in complete silence, sliding into the blind spot just as the guards reversed direction, his breath steady, his heartbeat disciplined and unshakable. From this vantage, he spotted a steel door marked with the same insignia he'd seen earlier, partially hidden behind cargo, and he knew instantly that whatever he sought lay behind that guarded threshold. He slipped around the containers, choosing angles that kept him invisible, moving with a grace built not from elegance but necessity, carved into him by nights spent outrunning death itself. At the door, he crouched low, prying open the rusted panel beside the lock, exposing tangled wires that hummed faintly, a crude warning that the men inside valued secrecy over aesthetics. His hands moved with quiet certainty, twisting and separating wires, until the lock clicked softly, a sound that carried more promise than triumph, the promise of answers finally within reach. Inside, the facility was dimly lit, industrial lights casting long shadows across crates, tarp-covered machinery, and metal walkways where only the bold or reckless dared travel after midnight. He advanced deeper, boots landing softly despite the metal flooring, his eyes adjusting quickly as he scanned for movement, knowing that men who expected intruders rarely stayed far from their traps. A faint conversation drifted from a corridor ahead, two voices low and male, discussing shipments, routes, and a name he recognized immediately, the name of the man who orchestrated the betrayal that started everything. That name cut through him like a blade, dredging up nights spent searching, fights survived, and the hollow ache of unburied vengeance waiting to be earned instead of imagined. He approached the corridor with silent purpose, each step calibrated, each breath measured, because the moment he reached that name's owner, there would be no turning back, only consequence. At the doorway, he glimpsed the two men standing over a table scattered with transit maps, both armed, both focused, unaware that a reckoning stood only a few feet behind them. He stepped into the room, letting the door creak just enough to announce his arrival, watching their shoulders tense as they reached instinctively for weapons they would never be fast enough to draw. Their eyes widened when they saw him, recognition mixing with disbelief because the man they thought consumed by fire had returned, alive, stronger, and anchored by a purpose they'd failed to extinguish. He advanced slowly, letting the air grow heavier with each step, his presence forcing the men backward until they realized retreat wasn't an option anymore, because the past they'd created had finally come home. And as the first man stumbled, the second hesitated, both understanding the truth too late. He felt that old, familiar calm settle over him, the calm a man feels right before justice is delivered by his own hands.